results.
Okay, great. Okay, so hi everyone, welcome back to the round. I'll just do results and then I'll do chronological order for the weighing of clashes. So for the results, we gave it a closing win, with first going to closing opposition, second going to closing government, third going to opening government, and fourth going to opening opposition. So again, it's CO, CG, OG, and then OO. So I'll first discuss the opening clash, and then I'll fill in all of the CG, CO against long cross and short cross as well. What did opening government give you in this debate? They tell us about the way that the curriculum works nowadays, wherein a lot of the competing interest that comes from the lower government, for example, is something that actually dictates the lower level quality that they might have. So what they do is that you're probably going to channel this elsewhere. You not get the teachers, you're probably not get the budgets that you want. Therefore, a lot of the ways that you can infiltrate and abuse the system is just going to be majority a lot better. What they say in terms of like how this is influenced and illustrated is just that if you have a budget coming from education, probably if you have voting incentives coming from local context, you're probably going to just do religious matters. You're just going to do something that's much more focused on short term, and that lessens the experience coming from education systems to actually have better capacity. The next thing that they say is just that a lot of the centralized government, for example, just has better capacity in terms of manpower and resources. So in terms of like just having a dedicated body, for example, like the central government, wherein there's a diverse backgrounds coming from expertise, you allow for them to channel these resources therefore, and therefore you lessen the kind of corruption that happens because there are checks and balances that happen within these spaces. Conversely, what did opening opposition also give you in this debate? They also tell you that probably a lot of the harms that opening government tells us is symmetric. Like, you know, a lot of the competing interests also falls into the central governments, and therefore that's something that you also have to weigh in. But the more so what they teaches us is that it's just going to be a much more priority towards the local context and therefore the local leaders as well. So what they tell us, if you lessen the barriers of entry, you're just going to allow for more teachers to actually go up into rural areas where probably the less disadvantageous places actually go for in the terms of the context that happens. So you have historically lesser resources coming to local context. There's lesser teachers that go to these rural areas, and therefore there's much more priority that goes to them. If you lower the barrier of entry in terms of these qualifications, you allow for these teachers to actually go towards these rural areas because there's less competition. There's like lesser political incentive that happens. The last thing that opening opposition says is just in terms of the quality of education, people will feel less resentment when they actually are forced to go here because it's much more voluntary. So when you're voluntarily going to a rural area, probably it's just going to show in terms of how much you care for your students, how much you care for like the local context in terms of how you teach them as well. So how did we weigh in terms of the clashes coming from opening clash? I think then in terms of a lot of it comes from the model that both of the houses appear to us. I think while the opening government clash on probably central government is not the best way to do this. I think what happens to be clear coming from them is why the federal government cares just enough for these local leaders or these local rural areas to actually just have much incentives in the first place to get these teachers out there, absent to what opening opposition tells us, wherein if you lower the barriers, probably you will just assume that these local teachers will actually go there in the first place. I think there could have been much more establishment of the material to why is this incentive going to be there, why is it less likely for these education systems to still have the problem of the rural areas to be there. It's not necessarily clear for us why the vulnerability clash is something that weighs in over the model that comes from opening government. Like sure, the symmetric clash coming from the harms is probably the same, but I think in terms of the model in which the manpower and resources is still going to be there coming from opening government, it still weighs heavily on probably if you have much more accountability, if you have much more checks and balances, that is where you get these local teachers to be there, rather than, for example, assuming if they just want to have much more leverage, much more competition, it's unsure that you still go and up towards the rural areas themselves, rather than, for example, the urban areas that probably will allow you for much more compensation, much more profit in the first place. So that is how we also weighed in opening clash and why OG weighed in over OO. Next, let's bring in CG and how they compared with opening clash then. So what did closing government tell you is debate? They tell you that, for example, it's the basic assurance coming from the education system to at least allow for some level of higher quality, so that the prerequisite of children to have better education is to have the basic quality of the teachers themselves or who gives these instructions in the first place. What they tell us is that centralization is important because that is where you get equitable systems in the first place. What they talk about is that resources comes from when you pull in scholarships, when you pull in the benefit of teachers. So it already talks about lesser resentment because you just allow for the benefit of teachers, like the living standards that they have, to increase marginally when you have these increases in the the first place when you hire the quality of education and how people perceive education systems in the first place. The next thing that they say is that it's just probably going to be better in terms of the accountability, in terms of how you centralize who to blame in the first place. Because the problem when it comes to local leaders is that you just enforce a lot of the metrics and accountabilities that are unstandardized. What they say coming from closing gov is that you know who to blame. There's a prime minister of education that you can spike your anger to, that these movements can call to question. Therefore, you can just already have the system of where you get accountability from, and therefore the metric of where you actually get change is something that's far better coming from there. So how did we weigh in coming from the short cross clash? So a lot of what closing government said already retracts a lot of the things what OO said in terms of like where do you get teachers to actually go towards the systems that they want in the first place. I think for both of you, the short cross comparison is just that both of you are very caring of the vulnerable systems. I think what closing government just does well is that they ensure that these local systems are going to be equitable in the ways that you have a standard education, a standard curriculum in the first place, not necessarily just focusing on one specific like local context in the first place, but more so on you allow for these the central government to actually have these lessons in the first place, so that is something that caters towards a general good rather than something that's something that's advantageous to one person over another. But the last thing here is also coming from closing government and opening gov. So I think the way that we can weigh in opening gov and closing gov is in the question on how do we weigh the materials that comes from closing gov in the same metric as the goal that happens in opening government, since you also both share the same the similar context of probably why the local context is probably just bad. What we do credit coming from closing gov is that, for one, the mechanisms are a lot clearer coming from them in terms of how you get accountability in the first place. So at least the metric of change of where people are actually going to put out their anger, or where the educational systems are actually going to be better off in the case that it fails coming from the state, is something that's clear in terms of the metric of where you actually get change to happen in the first place. But also in terms of how we actually view where the vulnerable systems are. So what closing government just says is that you focus a lot of your anger more towards the advantage of the systems itself. So centralization is something that's important because you actually get to dictate the kind of resources that allows for some level of places that need more scholarships than others, probably more benefits than others, and that is where you get people to actually be much more advantageous coming from them. So in terms of like the equality levels, you actually get much more coming from closing gov, but also in terms of the mechanisms where people are directed to have change coming from their governments is something that's much more questioned coming from them. And it's the same breath that also goes towards the opening opposition clash in terms of like where you get more accountability, where you get much more centralized systems, where you get much more resources put out, is something that also takes out the case coming from opening opposition. Lastly, let's do closing opposition. What did they tell you in this debate? The way that we view closing opposition is just to tell us the prerequisite for every other impact that happens in the round is when these parents who have the most proximate matter or care coming from these children will allow these children to go to these schools in the first place, because all of the other things, like if it's economically viable, if you allow these children to actually go and step up in the workplace, is still dependent on whether or not they actually go to school in the first place. What closing opposition says is that you allow for connection to happen when you have local leaders and local teachers to actually go towards these rural areas, when you have a lesser barrier of entry because most of them probably already have a lot of lesser capital than those coming from urban areas. There's lesser capacity for them to like work and therefore like teach them in these capacities. So what they say is that you allow for connection to happen, and therefore when you have relatability that happens coming from these teachers, therefore you that just gets much more incentive coming from these parents to perceive the benefits as much greater rather than an opportunity cost. So that is where you get, for example, a son of a farmer to probably go to school rather than, for example, just working on the field. How did we necessarily weigh these things out coming from CEO over all of the other benches? I think primarily coming from their opening opposition. I think just necessarily not just relying on why central government is bad. I think they also tell us about why is it probably going to extend from the traction of why is it economically viable, why is it something that's a very prerequisite towards why people actually go to school in the first place, which is something that unlocks all of the benefits coming from opening opposition, such as where the teachers are better off, where do you get the schools to be better education systems in the first place. So those are things that are just dependent on whether these children are actually going there, because that is where also the funding goes when you have good enrollment systems in the first place. Now going to the long cross, I think it also takes a lot of the comparative advantages that comes from opening government and just telling us like why central government is probably not the best way to do this, because they have the incentive, for example, for if urban teachers go here, the disconnect just happens a lot more. So when you have lower barriers of entry, you allow for these rural teachers who probably come from these rural areas to actually get the same comparative advantage. So you have lesser capacity for them to just exhaust a lot of these resources, and there's more capacity for them to just go back where they come from and therefore just teach and therefore sustain the education that comes from them. So in terms of like where sustainability of education comes from, but also where you pull in more teachers coming from rural areas to go back is much more apparent coming from CO. The last clash coming from closing government and closing opposition, primarily the disconnect that happens coming from CG and CO coming from the panel. It's just primarily on how do we credit in terms of the ways that the parents are going to associate, since there's also like federal government that if you don't get your child into school in the first place, probably there's going to be incentive to to just push in. So what we weighed coming from both the closing government and closing opposition is just that there's just incentive if you have a local context, for example, to just allow for parents to just have much more operations and power towards their students. Like it's very easy for them to pull out their children if they feel like the education system is no longer viable for them, or it's just a normalization of the culture of just not letting these students to actually go towards these schools if they feel like it's not going to have an opportunity for them to work in the labor conditions that they have in these rural areas. So by that definition, even if we take in the best case coming from closing government, wherein you allow for these accountability measures to happen, you allow for every child to go into these systems, I think in terms of where you actually get much more proximity, in terms of where you actually get control coming from these systems themselves, you allow for connection first to happen, and that is where all of the impacts do spring up in wherein you get like much more viability in terms of the students that actually get better education in the first place. So that's it coming from the oral education. That is it for all of the clashes as well. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any more feedback, just go into it. Thank you so much.
Any question from the bench?